The year was 1945. The world lay in ruins, cities flattened, economies shattered, and empires crumbling under the weight of two brutal world wars. Yet amid the smoke and silence of a broken earth, one nation emerged untouched on its own soil, powerful beyond comprehension: the United States of America. It didn't take tanks, or troops, or flags planted in foreign soil. No. America was about to master a far more subtle and far-reaching form of control, one that didn't require colonizing a single country. Instead, it would shape economies, ideas, wars, peace treaties, currencies, and even dreams. It all began with the Bretton Woods Conference. In a quiet New Hampshire resort, 44 nations gathered to rebuild the global economy. But beneath the surface of friendly cooperation, America had a plan. The U.S. pushed for a global economic system where currencies would be pegged to the U.S. dollar, while the dollar itself would be tied to gold. Other nations, exhausted and desperate, agreed. Just like that, the dollar became the spine of the world economy. That was the first invisible chain. Then came the Marshall Plan. Europe was starving. Factories were rubble. Winters were cruel. America offered $13 billion in aid. Today, over $150 billion adjusted for inflation. But this wasn't charity. To receive the money, countries had to agree to trade with the U.S., adopt Western democratic ideals, and allow American corporations into their markets. The plan rebuilt Europe, but also tethered it to American capital, influence, and ideology. Coca-Cola flowed through Berlin before the rubble had even cooled. Next, America built a network, not just of allies, but of dependents. NATO, the United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF, all headquartered in or heavily influenced by Washington, D.C. Through these institutions, the U.S. could shape the global agenda, decide who gets loans, who receives sanctions, who goes to war, and who gets peace. But this control wasn't just institutional, it was cultural. Hollywood became America's second army. Through cinema, music, fashion, and later, the internet, the U.S. exported its identity. A kid in Lagos wore a Yankees cap. A student in Seoul danced to hip-hop. A teen in Paris dreamed of Harvard. Slowly, subtly, the American dream replaced local dreams. People didn't need to be conquered to believe, they were seduced. In the shadows, America played its smartest card, the petrodollar. After the fall of Bretton Woods, President Nixon struck a secret deal with Saudi Arabia in 1974. In exchange for military protection and security, the Saudis, and eventually all OPEC nations, would sell oil only in U.S. dollars. That meant if a country wanted to buy oil, it first had to buy dollars. Global demand for the dollar skyrocketed. America could now print money to buy oil, while other countries had to earn or borrow dollars first. This made U.S. debt desirable. It made American banks the center of global finance. It made the U.S. economy too big to fail. With no formal empire, America now ruled through money, culture, and the illusion of freedom. In Latin America, it financed coups. In the Middle East, it armed dictators and rebels alike. In Asia, it built bases, not as conquerors, but as protectors. Always with a smiling face, a handshake, and a clause in the contract that made the receiving nation dependent, eternally grateful, or terrified. When the Cold War ended, America stood alone as a superpower. No colonies. No need. The world was already living in its image. And still, it wasn't enough. Enter Silicon Valley. The internet gave the U.S. something no empire had ever possessed: data. Facebook, Google, Amazon, tools that reached billions, not as conquerors but as companions. Every click, every word, every preference, logged. Nations could ban troops, but they couldn't stop code. In the digital age, America didn't need soldiers. It had algorithms. But not everyone bowed quietly. China rose, building its own tech, economy, and influence. Russia pushed back with hard power and disinformation. Global South nations began questioning why development meant dependency. Some called it neocolonialism without the name. Others called it modernity. Still, the mechanisms held. Swift transactions flowed through U.S.-controlled systems. Global trade still danced to the rhythm of the dollar. Hollywood still dazzled. Fast food chains still spread. American-made software still ran the phones in the hands of rebel leaders and presidents alike. And in Washington, policymakers knew the truth. Power wasn't in flags. It was in networks. Control the banks, you control the governments. Control the stories, you control the beliefs. Control the internet, you control the minds. Even today, when a nation defies America, whether through oil, tech, or war, they often find themselves boxed in, not by bombs, but by markets, sanctions, and narrative warfare. Few realize the prison has no walls, just contracts, treaties, and terms of service. America never needed to colonize. It built something far more enduring, a system. And the world, knowingly or not, lives in it. But systems, no matter how vast, are vulnerable, especially when built on perception. By the 2010s, the cracks began to show. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, launched under the banner of freedom, exposed the limits of American idealism. The images of drone strikes, toppled regimes, and civilian casualties began to chip away at the moral high ground. Allies questioned intentions. Rivals grew bold. The illusion of benevolence, America's most potent weapon, was fraying. Yet even as the military adventures soured, the real power remained unshaken, the dollar. In Africa, loans came from the IMF, with strings. In South America, markets could collapse on a whisper from Wall Street. In Europe, sanctions were crafted not in Brussels, but in Washington. And if a country stepped out of line, refused to follow the economic choreography, it was cut off, isolated, branded a pariah. This wasn't colonization. It was compliance. One of the clearest examples came in 2012. Iran. The U.S. wanted to stop its nuclear ambitions. But rather than send troops, it used sanctions. With a flick of the Treasury's pen, Iran was locked out of the global banking system. No one could trade with them. Oil sat unsold. Medicine dried up. Inflation crushed the people. And all of it, without a single American boot on Iranian soil. The message to the world was deafening: obey the rules or be unplugged. And those rules, still written in Washington. But perhaps the most ingenious method of control was debt. Through the World Bank, IMF, and private lenders, the U.S. helped develop countries by offering loans. Roads, airports, ports, and power plants were built. But when payments came due, the real cost was revealed. Nations had to privatize industries, cut public services, open their markets to foreign investors, usually American. When countries defaulted, America didn't send soldiers. It sent economists, policy consultants, trade negotiators. Some called it structural adjustment. Others called it economic occupation. Even America's greatest rivals found themselves tangled in the net. Take Russia. Post-Soviet collapse. The 1990s. The U.S. sent advisors, economists, and consultants. Industries were sold off. Oligarchs rose. And for a moment, Moscow looked more like Wall Street than the Kremlin. Putin himself would later call it a period of humiliation, and it shaped his entire foreign policy for the decades to come. Or China, often seen as America's greatest threat. And yet, for years, its export-driven miracle relied on selling goods to the American consumer. Chinese factories boomed, but in dollars. Even Beijing's massive foreign currency reserves were held largely in U.S. Treasury bonds. The very rise of China was, ironically, financed by the U.S. system. But America knew the risks. It understood that economic control was delicate, like holding water in your hands. Squeeze too tight, and it slips away. So, it adjusted again. Soft power surged. Netflix, Apple, Disney, YouTube. American platforms became the world's window to entertainment, news, and information. Even during political downturns, global youth still consumed American culture. A kid in Egypt watched the same Marvel movie as a kid in Brazil. A teenager in India danced to the same pop song as one in Canada. They all scrolled Instagram. They all typed in Google. They all lived, for better or worse, inside the American matrix. And this matrix was self-reinforcing. American values, freedom, individualism, capitalism, were baked into the very algorithms people used. Even dissent against the U.S. often traveled on platforms made in California. A protest tweet against Washington might just earn money for a tech company headquartered there. Yet even as America's influence deepened invisibly, the world began to wake up. Countries like Russia and China built their own banking systems, their own internets, their own media. BRICS nations discussed moving away from the dollar. African leaders demanded respect instead of lectures. Latin America revisited old wounds. Europe questioned its dependence on American security. But dismantling a system so deeply woven into the fabric of global life was no simple feat. You could criticize the U.S., you could resist its politics, but to completely exit its ecosystem? You'd have to stop trading, stop borrowing, stop watching, stop dreaming. And most nations weren't ready for that. The genius of America's control wasn't just its reach, it was its voluntary nature. Countries wanted to be part of the system. They wanted access to the dollar. They wanted Silicon Valley's innovations. They wanted the prestige of Ivy League diplomas and the credibility of American media coverage. In truth, most of the world wanted to be colonized. Not by flags. Not by troops. By opportunity. But behind the glow of screens, the rhythm of rap music, and the endless supply of credit cards was a simple truth. America still ruled. Without ever needing an empire. But the deeper you look, the clearer it becomes. Control isn't always loud. It's rarely declared. True dominance whispers. And America, through decades of quiet calibration, mastered that whisper so perfectly that most of the world mistook it for their own voice. Let's talk about elections. Foreign elections. While countries pride themselves on democratic processes, many never realize how American influence seeps into their ballots. NGOs, think tanks, tech consultants, and media partnerships, often funded through Washington or U.S.-based donors, shape narratives, support candidates, and nudge political tides. Not with guns. With grants. With guidance. With Google Trends. Presidents rise on promises crafted by foreign PR firms. Opposition parties tweet in English before they post in their own language. Political crises in Eastern Europe or Latin America are dissected on CNN before local news channels even catch up. The hand behind the curtain doesn't always wave a flag. It types in Silicon Valley, it speaks from Georgetown, and it never sleeps. Then came the tech wars. America no longer needed to install regimes or destabilize regions. With a few lines of code, it could decide whose voice mattered. Which videos went viral. Which posts were removed. Which financial services were denied. When a whistleblower exposes corruption, the story might trend globally, if the U.S. platform allows it. When a foreign government resists U.S. influence, it might find its online presence suddenly shrinking, throttled by policies to maintain community standards. And then there's the real-time surveillance. Thanks to American-made operating systems, cloud storage, social platforms, and even hardware chips, vast swaths of the planet's digital lives pass through U.S. servers. The NSA doesn't need spies in every country. It already sees the metadata of billions. Allies, enemies, civilians, it doesn't matter. In the 21st century, colonization doesn't need territory. It needs access. Remember Edward Snowden? His 2013 leaks revealed a stunning reality. America wasn't just watching its enemies, it was monitoring its friends. Germany, France, Brazil, their leaders, their corporations, their secrets, all within reach of a vast surveillance net cloaked as national security. And yet, even after the outrage, very few nations stepped away from the system. Why? Because they couldn't. Because stepping away meant severing themselves from the infrastructure of the modern world. From trade. From technology. From visibility. Because America hadn't just built a global network, it had made itself the default setting of human progress. Even humanitarianism became a vehicle for control. Foreign aid, disaster relief, development projects, most flowed through American frameworks. When catastrophe struck, the U.S. was there, with food, water, and conditions. The help was real. The gratitude was real. But so was the influence. NGOs often reported back to U.S. embassies. Reconstruction contracts went to U.S. companies. Education programs promoted Western ideals. Religious groups piggybacked on aid trucks. Soft power delivered in cardboard boxes. And then there was war, still lurking in the background. Despite mastering subtler forms of control, the U.S. never truly gave up its muscle. Its military bases encircle the planet, over 800 installations in more than 70 countries. No empire in history has ever maintained such a presence. Not Rome. Not Britain. When diplomacy fails, the muscle flexes. Iraq, Libya, Syria. The message wasn't just to those countries, it was to the world. Cooperate, and you get trade. Defy, and you get targeted. No colony needed. Just a demonstration of force to remind the globe who holds the remote. And while boots-on-the-ground invasions became rare, proxy wars flourished. America didn't need to fight directly. It supplied allies, trained militias, funded opposition, armed rebels. It controlled outcomes without bearing the public cost. Vietnam taught the U.S. one lesson: direct occupation burns too much political capital. But controlling the chessboard through other players? That was sustainable. Look to Ukraine. Look to Taiwan. Look to Africa's shifting alliances. Wherever geopolitics grows tense, American influence is there, sometimes quietly advising, sometimes overtly commanding, always shaping the battlefield to serve a wider goal: strategic supremacy without territorial burdens. And still, the most brilliant part of it all? America convinced the world that this wasn't colonization. Because it looked nothing like the past. There were no governors, no red lines on maps, no forced languages, just contracts, cables, content. No empire had ever achieved this level of voluntary submission. But history doesn't stay silent. Rising powers now study America's playbook. China builds its Belt and Road. Russia wages hybrid wars. Even smaller nations explore digital sovereignty. Countries begin shifting reserves from the dollar to gold or digital currency. They launch their own tech ecosystems. They demand to be heard not just as clients, but equals. And America? It watches. It adapts. Because that's what it does best. It doesn't rule by occupying land, it rules by occupying relevance. As long as the world keeps scrolling through American apps, paying in American dollars, dreaming American dreams, the control remains. The empire without borders. The throne without a crown. The colonizer that never called itself one. But no system, however vast, lasts forever. By the late 2020s, fault lines in the American-led order began to widen. And they weren't just from external rivals, they came from within. A deeply polarized political landscape had fractured trust in U.S. leadership. Citizens questioned not only their government, but the very institutions the world once admired. Mass protests shook major cities. Faith in elections, media, even democracy itself, began to erode. The same digital platforms that projected U.S. culture globally now became breeding grounds for chaos, disinformation, and extremism. And the world watched. For decades, America had exported its model, its democracy, its free markets, its way of life, as the gold standard. But now, countries asked, if America is struggling to uphold its own ideals, why should we keep following it? It was the beginning of something unthinkable just a decade earlier: the de-Americanization of the world. Not a rebellion. A quiet drift. Some nations, tired of dependency, built alternative systems. BRICS Plus emerged as a new economic bloc, trading in local currencies, offering development loans without political lectures. China expanded the digital Silk Road, wiring up Africa and Asia with non-Western infrastructure. Russia forged deeper security and energy ties across Eurasia. The dollar's dominance, though not dead, now had competition. America, for the first time in decades, felt the pressure, not of war, but of irrelevance. But Washington was never naive. It had seen empires fall: Britain, Spain, the Ottomans, the Soviets. It understood the danger not of defeat, but decline. And so it pivoted again. Instead of resisting the multipolar world, it began to seed influence within it. American universities opened campuses abroad. Tech giants partnered with foreign governments. Defense treaties were quietly modernized. And perhaps most importantly, AI and quantum computing became the next frontier of control. Where oil once ruled geopolitics, now data did. America poured billions into technologies that could forecast, manipulate, and even preempt global shifts. Algorithms that could sway elections. satellites that could track every shipment, intelligence that could predict economic crashes before they happened. And once again, the world plugged in. Governments, banks, corporations, they still relied on American tech. Even those who claimed independence ran on systems built in California, stored in Seattle, secured by Washington. The cables had gone deeper, the dependencies more invisible, the influence more embedded than ever. But this time, the world had a choice. And that was the one thing America could never fully control: consciousness. In countries across the globe, thinkers, artists, economists, and activists began to deconstruct the American model. They asked different questions. Why must progress be defined by consumerism? Why is freedom always equated with capitalism? Is there a better way? And those questions, more than sanctions or surveillance, were the real threat to the empire without borders. Because America's control had never just been about money or military or media. It had been about belief. The belief that America was the future, that its way was inevitable, that its power was benign. But now, people were awakening. Not in revolution, but in realization. And yet, paradoxically, it was that very realization that cemented America's final form of influence. Because even in resisting it, they acknowledged it. Even in building alternatives, they reacted to it. Even in seeking liberation, they defined it against what America represented. That's the ultimate mastery, not forcing submission, but becoming the reference point for every global decision. Not a ruler, but a compass. A standard. A shadow. One that stretches across oceans, across minds, across generations. And so we arrive at the truth. America never colonized the world in the old sense. No redcoats. No viceroys. No national anthems sung at gunpoint. Instead, it built a system so powerful, so adaptable, so seductive, that most of the world entered it willingly. Not because they had to, but because they thought they wanted to. That's not colonization. That's civilizational coding. And unless you can rewrite the entire program, every line of code, every historical precedent, every cultural archetype, it stays embedded, evolving, enduring. Because in the story of the 21st century, America doesn't need to occupy countries. It already occupies the world's imagination.